Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks, folks who've been here for the last two sessions. If this is your first time, welcome. Folks who are here on Zoom as well, thank you for joining us virtually. This is now week 3 of our 6-week series. In the first 2 sessions, of course, we covered some introduction to what imperialism is, what we mean when we use that term. And then in week 2, we started digging into more of the details of how empire works with a focus on sanctions, trade, and dollar imperialism. And to really build on a lot of the themes that we covered in last week's session in particular, today's session is focused on international finance and empire and the ways that the international financial system, both in terms of private finance, Wall Street, banks, and so on, but also more importantly, international financial institutions, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, really serve to uphold the imperialist world system in many different ways. And so yeah, we established really, I think, over the last 2 sessions, hopefully, how the many ways in which the global economy has been structurally designed, both through centuries of colonialism and then neocolonialism in the last 100 years, to keep the periphery, the global south, the third world, trapped in a state of dependence and underdevelopment, so that it can continually be a source of cheap resources, labor, and so on to be exploited by the imperial core. And of course, the conditions for this were established by centuries of plunder during the era of colonialism, which denied the third world the ability to develop its own economic potential, so that then when Europe's former colonies in the 20th century started gaining independence, they didn't have the basic levels of development, the basic levels of infrastructure necessary to maintain economic sovereignty as genuinely independent countries. Many decades later, we're in a situation where most of these countries are still trapped in those same cycles. And in addition to the role of trade, of unequal exchange that we talked about last week, one of the primary reasons for this is debt. And of course, the international financial system, as we'll talk about, is really set up to keep the third world trapped in cycles of debt that reinforce this system. Before we sort of get into it, I want to open up by showing a brief clip from a speech by someone who I'm sure folks are familiar with, Thomas Sankara, the first prime minister of Burkina Faso. It's a very famous speech he gave about debt. So we'll show about 3 minutes of it and then get into the presentation.
Nous estimons que la dette s'analyse d'abord de par ses origines. Les origines de la dette montrent les origines du colonialisme. Ceux qui nous ont prêté de l'argent, ce sont ceux-là qui nous ont colonisés. Ce sont les mêmes qui géraient nos États et nos économies. Ce sont les colonisateurs qui endettaient l'Afrique et étaient des bailleurs de fonds, leurs frères et cousins. Nous étions étrangers à cette dette. On ne doit pas la payer. La dette, c'est encore les néocolonialistes. Les colonisateurs se sont transformés en assistants techniques. En fait, devrions dire qu'ils se sont transformés en assassins techniques. Ce sont eux qui nous ont proposé des sources de financement, des bailleurs de fonds internes que l'on emploie chaque jour, comme s'il y avait des hommes dont le bâillement suffisait à créer le développement chez les autres. Ces bailleurs de fonds nous ont été conseillés, recommandés. On nous a présenté des montages financiers alléchants, des dossiers qui sont endettés pour 50 ans, 60 ans, même plus. C'est-à-dire qu'on nous a amenés à compromettre le peuple pendant 50 ans et plus. Mais la dette, c'est sa forme actuelle. Contrôlée, dominée par l'impérialisme. Une reconquête savamment organisée. Que l'Afrique, sa croissance, son développement obéissent à des paliers, à des normes qui nous sont totalement étrangères, faisant en sorte que chacun de nous devienne l'esclave financier, c'est-à-dire l'esclave tout court, de ceux qui ont eu une opportunité, la ruse, la fourberie de placer les fonds chez nous avec l'obligation de rembourser. De rembourser la dette. Ce n'est pas une question morale, ce n'est pas une question de ce prétendu honneur que de rembourser ou de ne pas rembourser. Monsieur le Président, nous avons écouté et applaudi le Premier ministre lorsqu'elle est intervenue ici même. Elle a dit, elle qui est européenne, que toute la dette ne peut pas être remboursée. La dette ne peut pas être remboursée. La dette ne peut pas être remboursée parce que, d'abord, si nous ne payons pas, les bailleurs de fonds ne mourront pas. Soyons-en sûrs. Par contre, si nous payons, c'est nous qui allons mourir.
So we wanted to open with this very powerful speech by Thomas Sankara because he was the leader, of course, of a country in West Africa, a very small, very impoverished country that had been brutally exploited by French colonialism, and upon independence had inherited a society that did not have the infrastructure to develop itself economically, that was reliant on borrowing from Europe, from its former colonizers, just to meet the basic needs of its people. And he understood, as someone who was in the position of having to lead a country like that, that debt, even though it was given in the name of development, in the name of aid, was really a trap to keep countries like Burkina Faso ensnared in these neo-colonial relations. And I think that that really sets up very nicely what we want to talk about today, especially because of the context in which Sankara was giving this speech. So this was given in 1987 at the summit of the Organization of African Unity, which later became the African Union. And this was happening amid the third world debt crisis of the 1980s, which, background on that, for folks who aren't familiar, as we've said, in the decades following independence, the nations of the third world had to borrow primarily from Western creditors to fund infrastructure, imports of food, medicine, and so on, other development projects. But this was rapidly growing unsustainable. In the 1970s, you saw the very first oil price shock in 1973 and 1974, when the OPEC countries limited the supply of oil, which caused prices to skyrocket. And this, as we talked about a bit last week, had ripple effects throughout the entire global economy, which means that in order to fund the imports they needed, countries in the global south suddenly needed much more development assistance because everything, all their imports was much more expensive. And so they had to borrow a lot more. Meanwhile, the OPEC countries that now had all this extra revenue from the high oil prices, they needed somewhere to invest it. And as we talked about last week in the session on dollar imperialism, they funneled that money into Western banks, particularly on Wall Street. Now, these banks are all too happy to lend that excess capital to developing third world countries, kind of like how in the 2008 financial crisis that was caused in large part by banks lending extremely high mortgages to pretty much anyone and everyone who wanted them without actually looking at the fundamentals of their ability to pay, and that creates a bubble that eventually bursts. A very similar situation was happening on a global scale at this time. So that's in the early 70s, and by the end of the 1970s, we have a series of economic developments. There's another oil price shock, there's a recession in the West, as well as a very sharp rise in interest rates that the US Federal Reserve triggers to curb inflation. All of these have even further ripple effects, which meant that the cost of servicing debt, of paying the fees, the interest, and so on for the global south rose dramatically at the same time that all of these countries in the global south, whose economies were reliant on exports to the West, their government revenues were declining dramatically because recessions in the West reduced demand for those exports from the global south. So all these different factors compound together. And what you have is a situation where third world countries, especially in Latin America, are unable to manage their debts. It's ballooning out of control. And in 1982, Mexico becomes the first country to default on its debt, to announce that it will not be able to meet its debt servicing obligations. This creates a domino effect of other countries across the global south defaulting or having to reschedule their debt payments. And by October of 1983, so 1 year later, there were 27 countries around the world, altogether owing more than $239 billion to Western creditors who were either defaulting or rescheduling their debt payments in other ways. The situation is rapidly spiraling out of control, and US banks, Western banks in general, but particularly on Wall Street, are suddenly faced with the prospect of widespread systemic defaults, which would mean that the entire global financial system could collapse. And so this is where international financial institutions, and in particular the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, stepped in to bail out the global south. But these so-called bailouts, as we'll talk about in our discussion of structural adjustment programs, actually serve to reinforce the debt patterns, reinforce the dependency of these global south countries. And so, yeah, how that worked and how that continues to work in practice is really going to be what we focus on for the rest of today's session. But before we get into that, I want to pass it over to my comrade Kea, who will talk us through the formation of these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, the context out of which they emerged, and how that has shaped their operations to this day. So I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, great. So the Bretton-Woods Institutions are initially created out of an intention of building a post-World War II international economic system. And unsurprisingly, the key decisions are really being driven by the US and the UK, but more significantly, the US. There are two kind of main things that are happening here. We have the destruction of Europe and Japan, which is basically creating a power vacuum with the US and the Soviet Union emerging as those main superpowers. And then simultaneously, a lot of the colonial empires, namely like the British Empire and the French Empire, are beginning to fracture, and it's causing a lot of colonization movements across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to seek independence, and simultaneously people looking for where to turn to because of the dependency that's been imposed the last few years. So while the establishment of the Bretton-Woods institutions are framed as this apolitical thing when they're rebuilding the post-war economy, they're really an effort to kind of defend or at least expand the reach of Western capitalism in the face of a potential challenge from the Soviet Union. And it'll end up really just promoting US interests instead. So this is kind of directly evidenced later on as we get into the 80s and 90s. But just to give some context of where we're starting, there's a conference held in 1944 in New Hampshire, a meeting of 44 of the Allied nations, mostly Western powers, and they're tasked with figuring out the post-war economic order. Their goal is basically to promote open markets, high employment, investment, and they basically begin enforcing this kind of market liberalization, deregulation, and what comes out of this is the IMF and the World Bank. That also included a plan to create the International Trade Organization, but that didn't come to be until the late 90s with the WTO. But the important thing to remember here is who the present parties were at this conference. So even though nominally countries like India and China and Brazil are present, their representation is largely symbolic. India is represented here by someone from the British Raj, colonial officials are present, and also Africa, who becomes one of the largest recipients of these loans, is not given a seat at the table at all. And then in terms of the influential figures who are leading this discussion, there are two to keep in mind. We have John Maynard Keynes from the UK and Harry Dexter White from the US. So Keynes is really advocating for like a more balanced international financial system, which would include an international currency, but naturally White's like US based capitalism kind of framework lands up prevailing. It's important to note here that Keynes' opposition to the US framework wasn't really about creating a more sovereign equality kind of thing, but more centered around what they feared that the US would impose on them, or how the US would eventually meddle in their affairs once the UK was in decline. One thing to note here, like we talked about, a lot of this is framed in the context of the BWIs being at their worst in the 80s and 90s, but I think that often has a tendency to take away from the fact that they started with this very imperial origin. So a lot of folks talk about by the end of 1972, there's a bunch of debt that is really accrued, and famously Robert McNamara, who is the president of the World Bank in '69, said by the end of 72, the debt totaled $75 billion and annual servicing was more than $7 billion. Debt servicing rose by 18% by 1970 and 20% in 1971. This average rate of increase of the debt since the 1960s has been almost twice as high as the rate of increase in the export revenues and these countries must use to service the debt. This situation cannot continue indefinitely. So while it's true that these neoliberal standards raised especially grave concerns, in reality, the formation of these institutions actually ended up replicating past predatory practices of the first financial institutions. Think of like the League of Nations and those who were present even around the World War I time. So just for example, the League of Nations had taken an active role in opening up the economies of former Ottoman Empire to international exploitation. So they also had, I think it was in the 1930s, removed China's control over its own tariff levels and industrial development. So really they were trying to get a way to figure out how can we insert ourselves without making it so outwardly imperial and interventionist. And that's where we get the IMF and the World Bank. And some early architects of these institutions really do want to abandon this outwardly imperial practice, but that naturally doesn't quite happen. So Jamie Martin wrote a book called The Meddlers, which I highly recommend, and maybe somebody wants to read this.
It was clear that governing global capitalism could not only involve managing relations between states, such as preventing one from going to war with another. It could also involve weighing in on sensitive domestic economic questions. But these institutions had to try to exercise these interventionist powers in ways that would not look like just more of the same kind of bullying empires have long visited on states on the peripheries of the global economy.
Thank you. So by offering a more formal representation to states where these interventionist powers are being applied, the institutions serve as legitimation machines, making these older imperial practices easier to cope with and in more of kind of like a sanitized way in what a lot of people consider an era of like self-determination for states in this like more post-colonial era. I think it's important to just remember that even though a lot of the World Bank and the IMF are framed as being very apolitical at their inception, there's a lot of rhetoric of multinationalism, multilateralism, economic cooperation. They really do reinforce these imperial interests and started that way, and it's kind of by design. And they're largely sold as solutions to this post-World War II economic instability, but in reality are a way of asserting power over these newly independent former colonized nations in the global south. So now Pranay's I'll hand it over to him to talk a little bit more about structure of both the World Bank and the IMF.
Thank you so much, Kaya, for that historical background. I think, yeah, as Kaya said, it's very important to really like drive home that these institutions have never been apolitical, that they were always designed with the intention of reconstructing an imperial world order for the post-war age, but it was not about overcoming any sort of imperial world order. So yeah, the two main institutions, of course, as Kaya said, that came out of the Bretton-Woods Conference in 1944 were the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank, technically it's the World Bank Group. It has several different institutions. Two big ones are the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which primarily provides loans to middle-income developing countries. And then you have the International Development Association, or IDA, which provides loans to the poorest and most low-income developing countries. The World Bank, these institutions provide loans for development projects, so things like infrastructure, political development, humanitarian programs, and so on. And from the 1970s on, the stated purpose of World Bank loans have really shifted increasingly towards promoting economic development and specifically promoting poverty reduction in the developing world. So the World Bank often presents itself in these even more sort of friendly, liberal, humanitarian terms than the IMF does, because by contrast, the IMF is much more focused on international economic governance. It still does couch its activities in these friendly liberal terms, but there's less of an emphasis on things like poverty alleviation and so on. And so from the IMF's website, I think this quote really drives us home. Quote, the IMF works to achieve sustainable growth and prosperity for all 191 member countries. It does so by supporting economic policies that promote financial stability and monetary cooperation, which are essential to increase productivity, job creation, and economic well-being. And then it goes on to say the IMF has three critical missions: furthering international monetary cooperation, encouraging the expansion of trade and economic growth, and discouraging policies that would harm prosperity. And keep that last point in mind, because that's very important. To fulfill these missions, IMF member countries will work collaboratively with each other and other international bodies, end quote. And so what you see here, but particularly from the IMF, these institutions talk about promoting prosperity, but the version of prosperity that they're trying to promote is very much a neoliberal one that is defined by continuous GDP growth. If the line keeps going up, that means everyone's doing better, even though in reality that's not actually the case, as we all know. Promoting free markets, open trade, all of these things, but not really like paying attention to the questions of structural inequality, is the distribution of wealth just, and so on. That's not what these institutions are actually concerned with. And so throughout the 1980s and 1990s in particular, the sort of governing ideology of these institutions was what's known as the Washington Consensus. So the Washington Consensus was first articulated in 1989 by an English economist named John Williamson as a sort of 10-point program for how international economics should work. And the main sort of gist of it is characterized by these neoliberal policies like austerity, cutting social spending, deregulation, particularly deregulation of labor protections, which means stripping back labor protections in the global south, trade liberalization, opening up to foreign capital, foreign investment, and then also privatizing state-owned enterprises, privatizing functions of the welfare state. These are all elements of the Washington Consensus that was guiding all of the decision-making in these institutions at the time. And so what we see is, as Cam mentioned, when these institutions were first getting formed at the Bretton-Woods conference, it was primarily the West that had a seat at the table, and that continues to hold true to this day. The governance structure of both the IMF and the World Bank disproportionately favor wealthier capitalist countries. So there's no election for the leaders of these institutions. Instead, the leaders of both the IMF and the World Bank are nominated by Western countries. And there's an unspoken rule: the World Bank president is always an American, and the IMF president is always a European. And that has always been the case, and probably will continue to be the case. And even formally, the voting shares in both of these institutions are similarly weighted in favor of the global north. So in the World Bank, a country's voting share in decision making is based on how much it has contributed financially to the overall capital reserves of the bank. And in the IMF, vote shares are determined based on what they call the country's relative economic position, which is a metric that takes into account GDP, but also the degree of a country's market openness. So you really see how decision-making and governance within these institutions is set up to favor countries that have adopted a Western-style capitalist neoliberal model. And of course, that favors countries that got rich through centuries of colonial plunder, while disadvantaging the underdeveloped countries that actually are relying on these institutions, that are affected by the decisions that these institutions are making. And using a metric like market openness for measuring a country's economic significance also puts at a disadvantage socialist countries, or even just countries that aren't socialist, but that choose things other than growth-based development models that care about the environment or the well-being of people over constant GDP growth. Those countries are also structurally disadvantaged in the governance of these institutions as well. There's an op-ed by Jason Hickel, who's an economic anthropologist in Al Jazeera, where he points out that for every vote the average person in the global north has in the IMF, the average person in the global south only has 1/8 of a vote. And if you look at the disparity between former colonies and their former colonizers, that really comes through even more clearly. So Bangladesh and Nigeria, he points out, both former British colonies. In the IMF, a British person's vote is worth 41 more times than a Bangladeshi person's vote, and it's worth 23 times more than a Nigerian's vote, even though Nigeria has more than 3 times the population of the UK. Bangladesh has more than 2.5 times the population of the UK. The former colonial power has a much stronger voting share in the IMF. The Articles of Agreement for both of these institutions also require any major decisions, any structural changes to their constitution or so on, to have an 85% majority vote. In both of these institutions, the US has more than 15% voting power, meaning that by default, the US is able to exercise a veto over any decisions that these institutions made. So even if a global south countries were able to somehow get together the votes to have some sort of structural reform, the US could simply veto that and nothing would be able to stop them. This really, I think, goes to what we've been talking about throughout the series, the way that the US really functions as a linchpin of the imperial world system. I think you see that come through things like this. And so it's not just about the governance of these institutions. Of course, the international financial system also engages in numerous predatory practices that disadvantage the global south. And one of these, perhaps the most significant, is what's known as conditionalities. So these are policy conditions that come with loans or development assistance from the IMF or World Bank, conditions that countries need to agree to in order to receive any sort of loan or assistance. These often include things like austerity, raising taxes and cutting social spending, cutting down minimum wages, food subsidies, privatizing state-owned enterprises, deregulating worker protections, and also increasing the extraction of natural resources and the export of those commodities as well. There was a 2014 study which examined all of the loans the IMF made between 1985 and 2014 and found more than 55,000 conditions that had been applied across 31 different countries. And of those, more than 15,000 of the 55,000 were relating to the management of external debt. Almost 14,000 of the conditions related to the financial sector and monetary policy, 13.8 thousand to relating to fiscal management and taxation and state budgeting. By comparison, just 822 were relating to poverty reduction. So that's things like increased social spending or a greater social safety net. The vast majority of these are about cutting back on the social welfare state, making a country more capitalist, more vulnerable to foreign investment, and less able to take care of its most vulnerable citizens. And so conditionalities often come with development loans from the World Bank and others, but I think they're most notorious in the context in which most people have heard about them is, oh, this is also a map of countries that have how many conditionalities are on IMF loans to them. And you can see Europe and North America, they don't even really show up on the map because of how few there are. Whereas West Africa by far has the most conditionalities on its loans. as well as Asia and Latin America as well. So structural adjustment programs, as I said, are perhaps the most notorious example of this, which is what I talked about earlier with the third world debt crisis. When a country is facing a balance of payments crisis, meaning it either can't afford to pay for its imports, it can't afford to service its debts, make payments on the interest for its debts, and so on, they turn to the IMF in particular for a bailout loan. But those loans come with conditions known as structural adjustment programs that require really comprehensive packages of economic reforms, essentially completely restructuring a country's economy along the neoliberal lines that we just talked about. So these programs are extremely widespread. A study found that between 1980 and 2014, 109 out of 137 developing countries had entered into at least one structural adjustment program. And these have really devastating costs on the global south that cannot be overstated. A 2021 study looked at the scale of unequal exchange and the transfer of value from the global south to the global north between 1960 and 2018. We've talked about this study before, and it found that in the 1960s, that transfer was happening at a rate of about $38 billion a year. By the mid-2000s, that was happening at a rate of nearly $3 trillion per year. And the study found, quote, the intensity of exploitation and the scale of unequal exchange increased significantly during the structural adjustment period of the 1980s and 1990s. During the same period, there's also a massive increase in price distortion between the global south and global north, meaning that the third world is receiving less for its exports and having to pay more for its imports. And this really increases during the 1980s and 90s. So those are the two graphs we see here, the value transfer to the west from the global south, and then the price distortion. And we see a massive increase happening between the 1980s and 1990s during the heyday of structural adjustment programs after the first third world debt crisis. These have really devastating humanitarian impacts. There was a 2017 study. It was a paper that reviewed 13 empirical studies on the effects of these programs on child and maternal health across the developing world. And it found that these studies are pretty much unanimous in saying that structural adjustment programs harms the health of, particularly of children and young mothers. A few of these reasons include reduced health expenditures because governments have to cut their social spending. You have to cut wages and benefits for workers, which affects labor conditions in the health sector. So nurses and doctors will go elsewhere. They'll migrate to other countries, often migrate to the West, in hopes of finding better pay and better working conditions. And then also there's greater privatization and the introduction of cost sharing, user fees for services that used to be, free healthcare for the public. Now people have to pay for them, meaning that poor people have less access to healthcare. Similarly, there have been really devastating educational outcomes as well, particularly when it comes to the rate of girls' education in schools in Global South. That often declines dramatically when structural adjustment programs are introduced as well.
Price distortion, why does that take place?
So essentially what happens is Global South countries, when they enact these structural adjustment programs, usually it's the price of labor decreases because they no longer have to pay as high as minimum wages. They no longer have to have the same worker protections. So the prices of their exports then decline dramatically as a result, meaning that the Global North can pay less for those exports and the revenues of these countries declines. But they still have to pay the same amount of money for the goods they're importing from the north. So the distortion occurs there. So structural adjustment programs were really widely used in the 80s and 90s, and then there was a lot of bad publicity around them. There was movements to oppose them, both in the global north, but also in these countries that were being affected by them. And as a result, the IMF leaders, they started promising reform and saying that we're moving away from structural adjustment. And they started instead replacing them with other sorts of programs that had different names, more euphemistic names, but actually served and functioned in the exact same way. So that study that I mentioned earlier that looked at the 55,000 different policy conditions that were mandated in IMF programs from the 80s to 2014, in that study, the researchers write, quote, there's a mismatch between what the IMF says and what the IMF actually does. Available evidence provides little support for the organization's fundamental transformation rhetoric. Instead, we find that the scale of organizational change was both modest and short-lived. And then they go on to say, quote, the IMF's trademark structural adjustment policies remain core elements of its recent lending programs. A really good example of this is quote unquote aid that the IMF offered during the COVID pandemic. Between March and October 2020, according to a report by Oxfam, the IMF dispersed 91 different bailout loans to 81 countries. These totaled over $100 billion. Of those 91 loans, 84% of them, so 76 loans, included austerity conditions that could, quote, result in deep cuts to public healthcare systems and pension schemes, wage freezes and cuts for public sector workers, such as doctors, nurses, and teachers, and unemployment benefits. And this is happening again during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when the last thing any country can afford is to be cutting back on its public healthcare system, cutting back on wages for doctors and nurses. And none of this was called structural adjustment, but that is in effect exactly what was being imposed on these countries who needed this bailout from the IMF because of the effect the pandemic was having. This is a dossier from the Tricontinental Institute that came out in 2023, which I think does a really good job of laying out the cycle of debt and austerity that structural adjustment traps the global south in. So what happens is that countries are already in a weakened position. They lack capital from centuries of colonial plunder. Then they're reliant on borrowing to finance their imports, to finance the development of their economies, and so on. And then eventually they end up in a balance of payments crisis because they're unable to pay for their imports, they're unable to service their debt. The IMF steps in, offers bailout loans with all of these neoliberal conditions, but then that reinforces the export-dependent model of these countries' economies, because in order to service their debts, they have to export even more. They have to ramp up production of these cheap commodities and raw materials that they export, but then that drives down the prices of those commodities because there's greater supply, so the price goes down, which then reduces the revenue that those governments are able to gain from their exports. This gets to the question that you were asking, Nell, about the price distortion. So as a result, governments have decreased revenues, they have to cut social spending even further, and then, of course, they have to borrow even more money just to pay off the existing debt they have and all the interest, the fees and everything that they owe on that debt. So this very quickly becomes a snowball effect. It becomes a vicious cycle where countries are borrowing to pay off their debt and then borrowing to pay off that additional debt, and the cycle never ends. And this is how countries end up in these really, really devastating cycles that, of course, have really horrific human impacts for the most vulnerable and most marginalized populations in these countries. In addition to the policy conditions that come with loans from international institutions, there's also something that's called surcharges, which are kind of like bank overdraft fees. They're additional fees the IMF imposes on countries that have especially high levels of debt or that have owed debt to the IMF for a very long time. Essentially, it's a way to punish countries that are heavily indebted and impoverished in the same way that, bank overdraft fees do the same thing for poor people by penalizing them for not having enough money in their accounts. The stated purpose for IMF surcharges is to supposedly, quote, limit the demand for IMF programs, offset the risk of non-payment, and encourage borrowers to pay back ahead of schedule, but it doesn't do any of those things. All that these surcharges do in practice is trap countries in even further cycles of debt. The Center for Economic and Policy Research estimates that in 2025, the top 5 countries impacted by surcharges will pay $1.3 billion of surcharges in 2025 alone, and then in the next 5 years, we'll have to pay more than $5 billion in surcharges. This is a list of countries that are expected to have to pay surcharges in 2026. In last October, there was a movement. There's a lot of calls from heads of state, from civil society to reform this program to eliminate surcharges. The IMF adopted some very minor reforms, but didn't actually address the underlying problem at all. And so as a result, there are 13 countries that are still expected to have to pay these fees totaling more than $5 billion by 2026. So that sort of is an overview of how the IMF and the World Bank work, how they are governed in ways that disadvantage the global south, and how their practices are very predatory towards countries in the periphery. I'm now going to pass it back off to Kea to talk through some case studies of how we've seen this play out in countries that have been exploited by the IMF and World Bank.
So keeping in mind all the things that Renee talked about, structural adjustment programs, the surcharges, we're going to look at the case study of Haiti and how the World Bank and the IMF have been involved there. So just to give some brief context, Haiti was the first country to gain independence from colonial rule through a successful slave rebellion in 1804. And following this rebellion, France was basically asking for compensation for its loss of property. And fearing military invasion and the threats that it was given, Haiti agrees to pay France 90 million gold francs over the next 122 years. So from 1957 to 1986, I know we're kind of jumping around timeline-wise, the country was ruled by the corrupt and US-backed Duvalier regime. So despite their brutality, they received not only strong backing from Western powers, but also the giving of loans, this particularly from the United States. And it's all basically due to that regime's anti-communist stand during the Cold War. And then later on, this debt will go on to be inherited by future governments and eventually hinder development. After the Duvalier regime was overthrown in 1986, a lot of the grassroots and civil society organizations that began to emerge began to question not only the compensation that France was asking for, but also the unjust debt burden that has been placed on them. The World Bank and IMF intervention that most people are most familiar with are in the 80s and 90s. At this point, structural adjustment programs are imposed on Haiti basically for a few main things: reducing tariffs on imported goods, and the main sector that this affects is the agricultural production sector, and then also foreign-led mining operations, which we'll get to in a second. So Haiti receives from the IMF loan valued around $24.6 million in exchange for slashing their rice tariffs, and they basically cut tariffs on rice imports from 35% to just 3%. So as you can imagine, Haitian farmers are largely unable to compete with the heavily subsidized form of foreign rice that's coming in. And while this is happening, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is also doling out $177 billion in farm subsidies to U.S. agro businesses between 1995 and 2006. Notably, the biggest beneficiary of this is Riceland Foods, and that's based in Arkansas, and it's actually the world's largest rice miller and market. So it seems like this is very coordinated, and if it seems that way, it's because it is. And imports to Haiti at this time grew by 150%, which is basically forcing farmers to abandon their farms. Simultaneously, when it comes to mining, countries are basically granted licensure to exploit Haiti's gold, and they begin not only to drive environmental degradation, but they're also operating under minimal oversight. So similar to what we talked about before, very loose labor laws and kind of any situation that's really ripe for exploitation. And then as you can see in this graph, you see basically the stagnant production of rice that's simultaneously the total supply and imports from the US is skyrocketing around this time. And prior to this, there wasn't a large portion of the diet of the country being taken up by rice. And since then, we've seen basically it's almost an over consumption of rice in this time. So between 1996 and 98, we also get the approval of loans for essential services in Haiti, which they include as healthcare, clean drinking water, and special loans to organize the national health system. But the thing that's important to remember here is that these loans are now stipulated on whatever the IMF and the World Bank dictate. And they're dictating here that new elections be held and approved by Haiti's parliament. And Haiti faced some delays in organizing elections until 2000, when Aristide's party wins by a large margin. After this election, basically all the international finance institutions start claiming that this election was flawed, and basically use this as a way to justify the blocking of aid that was already promised at this time. Notably, the Organization of American States led an observer mission to give an initial stamp of approval that said basically that, hey, this election was credible. And funnily enough, soon after those credibility things were corroborated, the Democratic Convergence, which is an opposition group funded by the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, basically said, hey, that's not true. They were actually bad elections. And we'll talk about that NED later on in future weeks. But instead of reasserting that the election was indeed a correct outcome and there wasn't any technical errors, the OAS actually backpedals and begins to change its assessment and basically say that there was voting irregularities and some technical errors, that they couldn't confirm that this was not an unmeddled with election. Ultimately, this results in the funds not being released. So the World Bank suspends most grants to Haiti, and all the disbursements that were promised are staying where they are. Then we get to 2004, at which point some of you may be familiar with the coup that takes place. So Jeffrey Sachs, who's the former advisor to the IMF and the World Bank, wrote that US officials surely know that the aid embargo would mean a balance of payments crisis, a rise in inflation, and a collapse of living standards, all of which fed chaos. So basically all the aid that has been revoked, despite being initially promised, is sowing a lot of internal strife in the country. On February 29th, 2004, Aristide is taken to the Central African Republic, an event that he himself describes as a kidnapping in service of the coup. Notably, the Western media at this time basically makes a big deal of this, saying that once he's kidnapped, Haiti can now qualify for millions of dollars of aid that was frozen in 1997 because of Haitian political chaos. And a few years after this happens, we actually get France's former ambassador to Haiti admitting to the New York Times that France and the United States effectively orchestrated the 2004 coup that ousted Aristide. And they said that one benefit of the coup was that it ended his campaign demanding France pay financial reparations to Haiti and calls for debt relief. So that was one of the primary reasons why they cited as He's not someone that we can ally ourselves with. Moving then to 2006, before this happens, there's an entry into the heavily indebted poor countries group, which is a group of states in the World Bank and the IMF dictates. And despite its inception years far past, and Haiti being one of the poorest countries in the Americas, Haiti was not even considered at the time, which people attribute to the political misalignment that was there with Haiti and the World Bank and the IMF. But then eventually they are allowed into the group, and they finished the program in 2009 and had about 1.2 billion of debt canceled. But it's important to remember that while this debt cancellation might have been a good step, if you enter this group, it's basically a way to enact, again, these harmful economic policies, and also many debts. The way that the debts work, it would just continue to accrue and kind of get into this vicious cycle that Pranay mentioned earlier. So even after getting debt relief, Haiti still owed $900 million. And nowhere in the debt relief process did rich countries obviously accept their role in creating Haiti's unjust debt. And then this only starts to get worse as we go to the natural disasters that Haiti is struck with. So after some debt was forgiven in the year before, Haiti still owed about 1.15 billion. That number grew to 1.3 billion after new loans were forgiven following the 2010 earthquake. And while public pressure did lead to some of these debts again being canceled, new money for rebuilding Haiti was always promised as loans, not grants, which would mean that eventually the country would again fall back into the cycles of debt that it was already in. Following that, we had the 2016 hurricane, and the Haitian government had external debts payments now expected to be 9.2% of the government's revenue in 2017 and 9.6% in 2018. So this is up from averaging 0.9 between 2011 and 2015. Notably, the IMF refused to cancel any debt after this hurricane, after Hurricane Matthew, because they said they didn't regard the economic damage of 23% of GDP as catastrophic. And in the UK, 23% of GDP would be the equivalent of $530 billion. And then moving to present, we're basically seeing kind of a re-upping of the same austerity measures, all of the things that we have already kind of figured out are not great. The raising of fuel prices was dictated by the IMF, and part of the deal reached in February of, I think it was 2022, was in exchange for $96 million in loans. The IMF demanded cuts to fuel and electricity subsidies and further privatization of the state electric utility. And these are just some examples of these more brutal austerity measures that the IMF continues to perpetrate elsewhere. Another important case study to mention is that of Sri Lanka. Because the IMF and the World Bank are beginning in the 40s, and also Sri Lanka is basically one of the first folks to join after gaining independence from British colonial rule. The state increasingly faced balance of payments issues due to the high import dependence and declining export earnings, which was obviously a result of colonial rule. The products it was mainly focused on was tea, rubber, and coconut. And the World Bank and the IMF supported infrastructure and financial sector development, but again, conditioned their loans on economic stabilization, which would set the stage for these future austerity and liberalization policies. So, for example, Sri Lanka was made to grow cash crops for exports instead of food for local use. These export-focused farming reforms basically ended up benefiting big agribusinesses and obviously hurting smaller farmers and fishers who are now exclusively relying on an expensive market input like seeds. And as these costs rise, many fall into debt, lose their land, and are forced to work as laborers or migrate to overseas jobs, just for example. And extremely high levels of poverty are concentrated in a lot of these rural areas, which is where more than 80% of Sri Lanka's poor live. So turning there to 1970s crisis and the structural adjustment program, at this time, Sri Lanka's economy was struggling not only with high inflation, but also stagnant growth and clear trade imbalances. This economic downturn also coincided with global shocks that we mentioned earlier, like the oil crisis. And to stabilize the situation, Sri Lanka has to engage with the IMF. So in return for assistance, the country agreed to adopt early forms of structural adjustment programs, which included currency devaluation, cutbacks in subsidies and public spending, and trade liberalization, which includes like lowering tariffs and reducing barriers for foreign investment. And all these are presented as being necessary for recovery. So not only do they weaken domestic industry and add to unemployment, but they're also exposing a lot of these vulnerable populations to economic shock. And it's very, I think, it's important to mention the rural infrastructure and how that really collapsed under these SAPs. Then moving to more of a contemporary intervention. In 2022, Sri Lanka experienced the worst economic crisis since independence. It was driven by external shocks like COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war, but also domestic mismanagement and more prominently accrued debts from the IFIs, from the Bretton-Woods Institutions. With all of this happening, basically massive inflation and shortages triggered nationwide protests. And in July 2020, the president Rajapaksa led the country amid the uprising. So after this, the next president basically resumes negotiations. The IMF lends out a $2.9 billion bailout under the extended fund facility. And this marks Sri Lanka's 17th agreement with the IMF. And all of these are conditioned on basically a sweeping set of neoliberal reforms. Some of them include tax reforms. So value-added tax was increased from 8% to 18%. Utility price hikes. So electricity and fuel prices are tripled. We had public spending cuts, so reductions in health and education, privatization pressures. The government basically began trying to plan privatization for their petroleum corporation and electricity board. And there also was simultaneously a crackdown on dissent. So a lot of other austerity measures intensified, and so did repression. And there was a whole bunch of new laws that were introduced to basically make it illegal to initiate in like non-static protest, and social media criticism in a lot of ways was kind of criminalized. So there's a whole bunch of things that are happening that kind of come from this top-down imposition from the BWIs. Moving to kind of where we are now, domestic debt in Sri Lanka increased to $57 billion in March 2024, which is up from $52 billion at the end of the previous year. This growing debt is creating obviously a vicious cycle and forcing citizens to pay more taxes. This all happening while the value add tax has also been raised to 18%, income tax increased to 36%, and there's just a very rampant kind of tax injustice happening here. One thing that is kind of like a present example of how these institutions are also intertwined with things like Trump's tariffs is basically on Trump's Liberation Day, he included a 44% duty on Sri Lanka's apparel exports to the US, and that's its largest export market. This blow to the Sri Lankan ready-made garment industry created really deep threats into its already fragile economic state in the garment industry. Not only does it weaken the currency, it also drove up inflation, led to a lot of job loss. And this entire example really undermines the entire core assumption of Sri Lanka's IMF-backed economic recovery plan, right? So you're hinging on this export-led growth to meet strict fiscal targets and service foreign debt. And the IMF program ties Sri Lanka's budgetary stability to rising exports, especially garments. And it's basically leaving the entire country heavily exposed to external shocks like US tariffs. This is just one example that showcases the dangers of this continued model, which prioritizes debt repayment and this foreign investor confidence over any type of domestic resilience. Instead of basically building up any type of market internally that would be able to sustain themselves, the Trump administration's case just showcases how things can kind of turn on a dime when that does come to fruition. Now I'm going to pass it over to Pranay to talk a little bit more about the role of the private financial sector in corroborating those patterns of debt.
Thank you so much, Kea. I think both of those examples are really important because something that they really show as well, human costs and economic costs of all of this, is also the fact that the IMF and the World Bank, right, they're giving these loans. They obviously are pursuing repayment on those loans. That's the entire point of debt. But really what it's about is even less, I think, about getting the actual money back, because they're willing, if a country can't pay back its debt, they're willing to work with these governments to offer various forms of forgiveness, restructuring. This is the heavily indebted poor countries initiative that Haiti entered into, for example. But that will then come at the expense, of course, of these deeper structural reforms that in the long run make these countries more vulnerable to capitalism, more vulnerable to exploitation by foreign companies and so on. Really, what these institutions are about isn't about getting money out of the global south through debt payments. It's about structuring the global economy in a way that these countries are then forced into these cycles of dependence through export-led economic models and so on. But the IMF and the World Bank are just part of the equation here, and I want to talk now about the role of the private financial sector in all of this. It's usually the IMF and the World Bank that get a lot of the attention and outrage from activists when we talk about global South debt. But Wall Street in particular plays a very important role in keeping these patterns going. So, and then the role of the international institutions step in when those debts to private sector lenders become unsustainable. So in 2021, 62% of the debt owed by developing countries was owed to private creditors, and that was up from 47% in 2010. So compared to 62% owed to private creditors, just 24% is owed to the IMF and the World Bank and other multilateral lending institutions. An interesting part of this is that most of these institutions, of course, are based on Wall Street. They're banks in New York. So more than half of this debt is governed by New York state law. There's actually a bill that's in the state legislature. I believe Zoran Mamdani is the one who introduced that bill actually to essentially regulate that to prevent these Wall Street banks from going after global South countries to squeeze these debt payments out of them. But one of the most sort of notorious actors in all of this is what is known as vulture funds, which are essentially hedge funds that buy up the debt of distressed global South countries at very deeply discounted rates. And then they refuse to participate in any sort of restructuring. They refuse to negotiate at all. Instead, they try to collect full repayment of those debts, which means that if you're one of those vulture funds, you can get a return of anywhere between 300% to 2,000% on average on your investment. The most infamous example of this is Argentina. So in 2001, Argentina was undergoing a massive economic depression. It was the worst economic crisis it ever experienced, and it defaulted on over $132 billion of debt. The government negotiated a sort of debt restructuring package, which 93% of its creditors agreed to, restructured terms, forgiveness of certain amounts of the debt. But 7% of the creditors were holdouts, and those 7% were vulture funds. They weren't the ones who had lent money to Argentina. They had bought up that debt from the original lenders for pennies on the dollar. And now they wanted to pursue repayment in full to get those massive 300 to 2,000% return on their investment. And so what these vulture funds did was they sued the Argentinian government. They sued it in US courts, in New York courts, because of course the debt agreements had been signed under US law, US jurisdiction. In 2012, a US federal court ruled not only did Argentina have to pay $4.65 billion to those vulture funds, but they couldn't pay anything to the other 93% of their creditors who had accepted restructuring deals until the vulture funds were repaid in full. So essentially, like what you have is a US federal court dictating what a sovereign government in the global South is doing with its debt, nullifying its ability to negotiate its own debt restructuring until you pay these vulture funds who aren't even the ones who lent the money to Argentina in the first place. And we've really seen a sharp increase in the use of lawsuits by vulture funds to try and squeeze money out of the global South. In the 1980s, the early 1990s, less than 10% of sovereign debt crises involved a lawsuit by creditors. By the 2000s, half of all sovereign debt crises involved at least one lawsuit by creditors. So vulture funds are sort of, I think, a aspect of this that often doesn't get talked about, but are really important to how all of this works. And unlike the IMF and the World Bank, which would be willing maybe to, like I said, negotiate, restructure things on these deeper conditions of economic reforms that end up reinforcing global capitalism in a more big picture way, these are just ultimately like money grubbing institutions that are just trying to squeeze countries to the tunes of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, which compound existing crises and make things worse again for the working class, for the poor people in these countries. Another element of the private sector in all of this is what's called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. Again, rarely talked about, but extremely harmful aspect of the global financial system, which essentially allows foreign investors to sue a country if it takes policy measures that are harmful to that investor's profits. And these lawsuits are not tried by judges in any sort of national or international court. Instead, the suits are tried in these arbitration panels, whose members usually are private corporate lawyers that are chosen by both the investor and the state being sued. No other arrangement do you get to choose the people who are going to try the lawsuit that you're filing, but in this case, private corporations get to choose private corporate lawyers to essentially be the panelists in these arbitration panels. This is something that emerged in the mid-20th century as a response to this wave, this phenomenon of all these newly independent countries were nationalizing foreign-held assets, and which meant that it was hurting the profits of these foreign corporations. But it, to this day, remains a feature of pretty much every international trade agreement, and every international investment agreement will include some sort of clause mandating investor-state dispute settlement. One of the biggest avenues for these lawsuits is what's called the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, which is part of the World Bank Group. But there's other centers in London and elsewhere as well where these arbitration panels happen. It's estimated that over $113 billion of taxpayer money has been paid to investors in these settlements. And of that, the vast majority, over $80 billion, has been to fossil fuel companies who are filing lawsuits in response to climate policies that particularly countries in the global south have enacted. Countries in the global north in Europe are affected by this, but it's overwhelmingly global south countries. So of corporations that have launched ISDS cases against countries in Africa, over 70% of them are based in the US, Europe, or Australia. So it's primarily Western companies that are suing global south governments. Similarly, 86% of claims against countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have come from companies that are based in the US, Canada, or Europe.
Yes, so the 80 billion for the fossil fuel companies, is that because of companies trying to nationalize the production of fossil fuels or trying to reduce the consumption of it?
I think it's a mix. I mean, really, it's if you're a company and you can make the case that this government took any sort of policy that's hurting our profits, whether they're nationalizing this industry or this company, or they're putting in an electric vehicle subsidy that makes less demand for my oil that I'm selling. Like, if you can make that case, then you can file one of these lawsuits. So it's a mix of all of the above. Again, there's very few other equivalents of something that gives companies this much completely unrestricted power to sue sovereign governments. But this is something that doesn't really get talked about as much, but I think it's something important to be aware of when we're talking about the role of the private sector.
What's to stop the government from just saying, no, we're not going to sit down with you? Like, what is the legal basis for this?
On paper, the legal consequences involved. You're not going to be able to sign investment agreements or trade agreements in the future. But ultimately, like Matteo was saying in the last session, the US is not above orchestrating a coup against countries that don't play ball. There's always a gun to every global south country's head and all of these things. But there are sort of above board measures as well that reinforce this. Countries who want to still be eligible for any sorts of loans, trade agreements, and so on will not be able to do so easily if they don't submit to this. Although there have been cases of countries that have tried to withdraw to varying degrees of success. And on that point, actually, I will pass it over now to Hea to talk about ways that countries have sought to resist financial imperialism. So over to you.
The first case we can talk about is Cuba's withdrawal from the IMF, which happens in 1964 and from the World Bank in 1967. This decision was pretty explicitly rooted in Cuba's belief that these institutions were instruments of US imperialism, and a lot of folks just directly said so. Also, this is in the context of IMF and the World Bank already not being particularly friendly after the Cuban Revolution. So following its withdrawal from these institutions, Cuba faced expanding and escalating sanctions from the US. Beginning in 1960, it was also faced with a variety of acts to damage it. Most prominently, we have the Coercively Act, which is in 1992. It's backed by Bill Clinton and signed by George Bush, and it reintroduces a blockade for subsidiaries of US-backed companies and prevented any ships that had docked in Cuban harbors from docking in US ports for 180 days. We also got the Helms-Burton Act in 1996, again signed by Bill Clinton, and it made the US blockade extraterritorial by threatening any non-US companies with legal action if they engage in any business or traded or invested in Cuban assets that were confiscated by the revolution. So in response to isolation, Cuba sought some type of regional solidarity with those that they could find. And this is playing out in the Bolivarian Alliance for People of Our America, or ALBA for short. It's founded in 2004 with Venezuela. And ALBA aims to promote a social development and mutual cooperation, trade based on solidarity rather than profit. So unlike other international financial institutions, it claimed to not impose loan conditions and would hope to function based on a consensus of all of its members. Obviously, that's a pretty stark difference to what Cuba was having to deal with before this. Another example of this is also seen in Venezuela. In 2007, Hugo Chavez severed ties with the IMF and the World Bank. This was again in a broader strategy to combat any type of imperialist powers, and he actually called out generally that the World Bank and the IMF were tools of empire and served the interests in the North, which seems like it's obvious, but being said explicitly by someone had a lot of power. And the Minister of Finance, Rodrigo Cabezas, points to the IMF's consistent underprojection of Venezuela's growth in the country. So he says, It seems like the prognosis has been a kind of political commitment in order to discredit the success of the Venezuelan economy in the last few years. The fund report and its recommendations were also rejected by Argentina and Ecuador. So basically, the fund had made a variety of predictions about what the Venezuelan economy would look like, and they kind of saw time and time again that these were proven wrong. This view is also supported by an April report from a US-backed think tank, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which basically found that the IMF projections were consistently wrong for both the states of Argentina and Venezuela. It found pretty regular overestimation in growth when Argentina was following fund prescriptions, and underestimates anytime a country is in a dispute with the IMF or the World Bank over debt renegotiation. It concluded that the IMF's large and repeated errors in projecting GDP growth in Argentina and undergrowth in Venezuela strongly supports that these errors were politically driven. So following this severance with the World Bank and the IMF, we also see Venezuela nationalizing a lot of its key sectors, particularly oil, and the government then redirects this oil revenue to programs that are helping reduce poverty and inequality. Following this, we see Venezuela getting slapped with, again, economic sanctions and political pressure from the US. This includes restrictions to access to the international financial markets and also support for opposition groups in Venezuela. Generally, these actions almost always tend to undermine sovereignty and any type of alternative development model that could exist. Venezuela is really a case study for how US intervention will do what it wants in terms of if it sees that you are not playing ball, it will take some type of action. And this is evidenced from 2002 to 2012, just alone as an example. CIA cut out the National Endowment for Democracy. I gave it $100 million to create 300 NGOs that were opposed to the Bolivarian Revolution, which was launched by President Chavez. So really there's like a quick turnaround when it comes to what can we do to get these people to play ball. In terms of alternatives to the IMF and the World Bank, some of y'all might be familiar with the New Development Bank, which is launched by BRICS. BRICS established the NDB in 2014, and it was basically just a way to create an alternative to the current financial institutions. They wanted to focus more on sustainable development projects and basically less imposing of stringent conditions. Some of the key features that folks like to highlight are more equal voting systems, local currency financing, and again, that focus on sustainable development. But obviously there's a lot of criticism of this model as well. We have Patrick Bond, who's a prominent researcher on BRICS and resistance to debt, saying the NDB does not yet appear as an alternative to a system of the Washington-centric development finance that is rife with problems. Instead, it appears from the South African case that the ingredients exist for the NDB to amplify uneven development through financing some of the country's most notoriously corrupt institutions for projects which are themselves highly dubious. So the NDB doesn't necessarily break with any of the domination of the dollar and can often reproduce the same extractivist export model that we've seen elsewhere. A lot of people say BRICS rejects the geopolitics of imperialism, but is pretty willing to accept neoliberal standards. So in a lot of ways, it works within, not against global financial power, but is still seen as an alternative to this US-led and backed international financial institutions. We also have the new International Economic Order that was proposed in the 70s by the Group of 77 at the UN. It aimed to address the imbalances between developed and underdeveloped countries, and key objectives include fairer trade terms, control over natural resources, and increased development assistance. As you can see, pretty clear which countries supported it and which didn't, and also those same countries happen to be the same people who are, have the most sway in the IMF and the World Bank. Elements of the NIEO have re-emerged in current discussions on global economic reform, particularly in the context of debt justice and climate finance, but there are kind of a few main things that they call for that should be highlighted. Maybe could be talked about in our discussion when we talk about what do possible alternatives look like. So that includes sovereign equality of all states, so non-interference being kind of integral to a lot of these loans, just and equitable relationships between the price of raw materials and other goods exported by developing countries, and then also the strengthening of bilateral and multilateral international assistance to promote industrialization in developing countries, but in particular, some type of provision for sufficient financial resources and opportunities for domestic development. Also pretty prominent right now is the Belt and Road initiatives that I'm sure folks have heard of. A lot of this has led to pretty key investment in African infrastructure, including a lot of transportation, railways, ports, and energy projects. We had the standard gauge railway in Kenya, which has improved transportation and kind of made a splash publicly. And while China is a major economic partner for a lot of these countries, the main thing that it really serves to do is bypass the traditional Western financial institutions. So a lot of the needed infrastructure is kind of acting more as a counterweight rather than something that might be a long-term solution to how this debt is accrued. And then also the Bank of the South, Banco del Sur, in 2009 was proposed by Venezuela and Argentina. It basically aims to provide some type of finance for development projects in Latin America specifically, again, without conditionalities. It focuses on regional integration, economic sovereignty, and it did face a lot of challenges when it came to securing capital and any type of political support from member countries. So that's limited its operational capacity a lot. And many believe that the bank should be a mechanism to promote some type of form of alternate development. And the main things that it's hoping to move forward with are inter-regional trade and food and energy sovereignty, but also like a free circulation of workers, which is kind of an interesting component that the IMF and the World Bank obviously have not been particularly fans of. For other people, the Bank of the South will kind of just act as another development bank with considerable differences among the members in terms of the purpose of the bank, just due to like differing alliances and relationships with the global north. Some other just proposals and movements to not necessarily fleshed out, but the African Monetary Fund was proposed by the African Union to provide financial support to specifically African countries facing payment crises. We also have South-South cooperation just as kind of theoretical framework. This approach really emphasizes collaboration between developing countries and hopes to kind of foster mutual development without any reliance on Western financial institutions. And then obviously the debt justice campaigns, which have grown far more prominent after the neoliberal standards were imposed. So it's just groups advocating for cancellation of unjust debts and climate finance alternatives that don't impose any type of debt burdens, rather focus more on seeking grants to address climate change initiatives that are being pushed. So those are just some theoretical things. I will pass it now to Renee to talk about the temporary substance and post-system.
I will just say on the new international economic order, as Kate said, that was first proposed in the 70s. And last year, Progressive International put out a really great report, essentially updating. It's for the 50th anniversary, 74 to 2024, 50th anniversary of the NIEO, put out a report of essentially what would an updated NIEO look like for our current moment, especially in light of the climate crisis as one of the new crises that wasn't so much on the radar 50 years ago. And that was a product of a multi-year process of bringing together scholars, parliamentarians, and other experts from across the global south. And it's a really great framework that I found really enriching, so I encourage folks to check it out. So yeah, I think in light of everything that Kaya said, I want to bring it up to where we are now as we close out and the contemporary relevance of all of this. I meant that the Sankara speech that we opened up with was given in the context of a third world debt crisis of the 1980s. But a lot of people are saying that today we are entering a new third world debt crisis. As in Sankara's time, debt in the global south is once again reaching unsustainable levels. But now, of course, it's happening in a context in which these countries have not only been devastated by centuries of colonialism, have also been further devastated by centuries of colonialism plus decades of neoliberal policies and reforms that have been imposed on them that have made them even less able to meet these debt burdens for the reasons that we've already talked about. So in March of this year, UNCTAD, which is the UN Conference on Trade and Development, warned that the external debt of developing countries has quadrupled over the last 2 decades, reaching a record $11.4 trillion in 2023. Which is equivalent to 99% of the export earnings of these countries. And this report also noted that public debt is growing twice as fast in developing countries as it is in developed countries. The IMF has reported that more than half of the world's low-income countries are experiencing or are at high risk of what they call debt distress, which means that they're having difficulties repaying their debts. And across 48 countries, more than 3.3 billion people in the world live in states whose governments have to spend more on debt servicing than they're able to spend on education or on health. 2024 study found that, quote, debt service is absorbing 41.5% of budget revenues, 41.6% of spending, and 8.4% of GDP on average across 144 developing countries. So the scale of the crisis is actually much worse today than it ever was in the 80s and ever was at the time that Sankara was giving that speech, which I think really drives home the reason why these issues are even more important today. I want to conclude with a quote from the same Sankara speech that we showed at the beginning of the lecture. So towards the end of the speech, he says, quote, "I want our conference to take on the urgent need to plainly say that we cannot repay the debt, not in a warlike or bellicose spirit, but to prevent us from being individually assassinated. If Burkina Faso stands alone in refusing to pay, I will not be here for the next conference." Sankara gave the speech on July 29th, 1987. A few months later, on October 15th, he was assassinated in a coup that was widely believed to have been backed by France and the United States, and largely because he did a lot of things that were very controversial to the imperialist class, the sorts of reforms that he imposed in his country to empower women, empower poor people, build a social safety net. All of those were, of course, controversial, and they were seen as too communist for the liking of the West, but really what did it in the end was the way he spoke about debt. He was one of the figureheads calling for the new international economic order, and his threat that the global South might refuse to pay its debts was too much for the West to handle, and so they killed him for it. And so I think that's just a note that I want to end on as we move into the discussion for today's session. So with that, I want to open it up for questions, and also we'll sort of, to wrap it into one, we'll add this discussion question on the board as well. So what would a more just and less predatory financial architecture for global South development look like? What are the biggest challenges and opportunities facing some of the potential alternatives that we've talked about here today? So if you have thoughts on this question, but also if you have questions on anything that was said. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is for all the alternative banks like Banco del Sur and Vulture and all of that. Do they go by this launching country's currency or dollars?
My guess is it probably varies. I don't know specifically. I do know that the BRICS New Development Bank, one of the criticisms that has been made of it is actually that its loans are also denominated in US dollars, which is part of why it has not been able to pose as an alternative to the degree that it hopes to be. There's a speech by a Brazilian economist named Pablo Nogueira Batista, who used to be the chair of the New Development Bank, and he, after his term as chair ended, actually gave a speech where he talked about that as being the biggest reason why the bank was not able to meet the high ambitions it had set for itself. But one element of the NIEO that I did want to mention, I don't know if it was in the original proposal from the 70s, but certainly in what the Progressive International has put out, is the formation of debtors clubs. So in the same way that you have groupings like OPEC, where all these countries that produce oil can come together and exercise their collective action to set prices, and ultimately they stand to benefit from that. As Sankara said in his speech, individual countries refuse to pay, they'll just get assassinated like happened to him. But if debtor countries, which is most of the countries on Earth, were able to come together at a regional level or at a global level to coordinate their repayment or non-repayment of debt, it would be much harder for the imperial court to respond in quite the same way as they can for individual countries, which is, I think, part of why the emphasis on South-South cooperation is so important. That's not something that like individual countries could take on.
I've heard a lot of criticisms of China's investment in development projects in Africa regarding the terms of their loans. Can folks speak to how their model compares to the World Bank and the IMF? Is it worse? Is it better?
I can speak to that. So like also with full disclosure, I'm a big China guy. My friends know this about me. I think not that China's perfect, but I think there's a reason why countries in the global South, particularly in Africa, are turning to China rather than to Europe, rather than to the IMF and World Bank, because they are being offered a better deal. There is this sort of narrative about what you hear this term of like debt trap diplomacy, that China essentially uses debt to then like force political conditions on these countries in the same way the IMF does. That's mostly media spin. There's a scholar named Deborah Bodegum who has actually like looked into the details of a lot of Chinese loans to Sri Lanka, also to countries in Africa as well, and found that like the actual level of political influence that China exerts with its loans is pretty much nothing in comparison to the political influence that the IMF or the World Bank or even just individual Western countries exert. Obviously, a lot of criticisms to be made about the model that China exports in Africa. It is Chinese companies that are investing, and so profits are going to China, and there's obviously labor exploitation, there's all these problems, but it is still a better deal than what these countries are getting from the West, which is why they're turning to China instead. It is complex and nuanced, but personally, I'm a China guy. I think, yeah, there's more flexibility with sort of like the terms of and the schedule of repayment. Part of that is the IMF is maybe more willing to forgive debt, but that's because it gives it one other avenue by which it can impose structural adjustment. And yeah, we can forgive $1 billion in debt, but then you'll privatize all these institutions that will end up sending more billions of dollars back to the global north in the long run. China's not motivated by those same sort of considerations.
New development banks and new economic order. A lot of the economists that are leading these, they're right from the global south, but they've been trained in Western institutions or institutions that teach the same neoliberal orthodoxy in terms of economics. And so like some of the things that they're proposing, same neoliberal economic orthodoxy, and that's not really going to be a solution.
That's a fair criticism. It's kind of a catch-22, right? There's a reason why these economists have been trained in Western institutions with these Western frameworks. It's because that is the way things have been structurally set up, where all the most elite institutions are concentrated in the West and teach certain things. With my podcast, I had an episode, like one of the first episodes I did was with Michael Gallant from CIFR about the new international economic order. And something that he talked about in that interview was even the like Marxists and socialists and communists who are involved in the production of this document, none of them think that this is the way we overthrow global capitalism. Like ultimately, the economic order envisioned in the new international economic order is still a capitalist one. It still is subject to all of the problems that global capitalism is subject to. But I think what the experience of the last 100 years, particularly what became of the third worldist movement, of all these decolonial and socialist projects in the global south, shows us is that if you don't have sovereignty, which includes economic sovereignty, you cannot have any more fundamental structural transformation or any sort of socialist revolution. Like I think ultimately the real solution is socialism, right? I think we're sort of like we're all in agreement on that. But I think that if a country is trying to enact that on its own without a more baseline level of control over its resources and its ability to set the terms of its economy, that is just not going to work for any number of reasons. They'll get invaded, they'll get overthrown, or it'll just fail on its own terms, and then they'll be forced to take on more debt, right? So that's why I think that imperfect though these solutions are, they are important as a first step, while there is a larger sort of like revolutionary project that's undertaken. Next week's session, we'll turn away briefly from political economy to focus on international governance. So the international legal system, the United Nations Security Council, how do these institutions and systems provide a legal and governing framework for all of the dynamics we've been talking about so far. So thank you all so much for coming to this 3rd out of 6 sessions. And yeah, hope to see you all next week for a discussion of international governance and empire. Thank you all so much.